So if you can't name at least 3 common contingencies that buyers include in a contract, then you're not ready to sell your home. Listen up. I'm talking to you. If you're getting ready to sell your property, then you need to make sure that the agent that you choose to work with fully prepares you for the process. And that includes understanding all of the contingencies and the terminology to be able to get through this process. All right, so let's talk about contingencies. These are certain conditions that must be met by either the buyer or the seller in order to continue to the next step in the contract. Think of this as a subject to clause. This purchase is subject to a satisfactory inspection by a certain deadline. For example, if the buyer isn't satisfied or can't meet the terms of that deadline, then the contract can be terminated, and in most cases, the buyers can get their deposit back. Now, there are as many contingencies available as a buyer or sometimes a seller can think up, contingent upon a repair getting made prior to a closing, a contingency requiring an easement to be completed, a contingency period to review existing HOA documents or lease agreements, contingency requiring the sale of an existing home, etc., etc. Now, whether we're in a strong seller's market or a buyer's market makes a huge difference on the number of contingencies that a buyer can usually write into an offer. Now, when I started in real estate more than a decade ago, it was a buyer's market. That means we had a lot of available homes for our buyers to choose from. So in many cases, they held the cards. But the market that we're in now and have been for the past several years and probably will be for the foreseeable future, we've got multiple buyers bidding on the same house, which means buyers have to limit what contingencies to include in their offer in order to get their offer accepted. So let's talk about the common contingencies that we see in purchase contracts. Very common is the inspection contingency, and this protects a buyer against purchasing a home that is revealed to be in poor condition or requires major repairs that weren't disclosed. Now, if a buyer chooses to waive this contingency, then they're choosing to skip the inspection period. Now, as a seller, that may seem appealing to you, but I'd caution you that it can actually increase your chances of a lawsuit post-closing if there were known defects that you did not disclose. Now, the mortgage contingency, well, that covers a buyer if they're ultimately unable to obtain the mortgage. Now, sellers, you've got to understand the mortgage contingency deadline. It's typically about a week or two prior to the closing, which means your entire deal can fall apart at the very last minute if a buyer is unable to qualify for their loan. Now, cash buyers, they're really appealing because, well, obviously, their purchase isn't reliant upon qualifying for a mortgage. Now, what could cause a buyer's loan to get denied? Well, there's lots of things. So many things, I've seen it all. So their car breaks down and they decide that it's time for a new car. They take out a loan, not realizing that it's gonna cause their debt to income ratio to go crazy and go out of whack, and boom, they can't get their loan, or they lose their job and they don't have another one lined up, or they fail to disclose a loan that didn't show up on their initial credit check. Now, as your listing agent, I'm gonna make sure that the buyer is working with a reputable lender, somebody that has a great reputation. I know all of the questions to ask the lender to make sure they've done their diligence, to make sure that they've fully vetted, but sometimes things happen that are outside of anyone's control. That's why backup plans are important. So what about the appraisal contingency? This might be wrapped into a buyer's mortgage contingency. It might not be specifically stated, or it can be added as an additional contingency. You know, cash buyers, they can actually request an appraisal, but they need to make sure that it's part of their initial offer. Now, I have an appraisal series because it is so important to understand the ins and the outs of the appraisal and what are the options if a property doesn't appraise at the purchase price. So hop over after this video and check out that series. Now, a buyer or a seller, they can include contingencies that the purchase won't move forward unless another property is either purchased or sold. So let's say you're a seller and you're willing to sell your home, but you have to buy another property. Well, ideally, before we list your home, we've already identified that property and under contract. Now, let's say you're buying 123 Banana Street but you have to sell 456 Main Street in order to do that. So in an ideal strategy, we've been able to get 123 Banana Street under contract, and we've included a contingency that the purchase is subject to the sale of that property. And when you list Main Street, you're going to add a contingency to that contract that it is subject to being able to close on 123 Banana Street. So you can see that there are some pretty complicated steps there. And what if one or both of those have additional contingencies? The people that are buying or selling those at any point, any of those stacked cards could fall, and that could result in the whole thing tumbling down and making a giant mess. So you've got to make sure that you understand what's happening and that you're working with a seasoned pro that knows how to manage all of these complicated situations and who understands what needs to be put in place in order to keep things moving forward, and also to make sure that you are protected. Now, for sellers, every contingency is a potential roadblock or a deal breaker. Now, when the seller accepts an offer that contains a contingency clause or multiple contingencies, they're effectively taking their home off the market for a specific period of time until those conditions need to be met. And therefore, sellers should ensure that there's an agreed upon time frame or a deadline for those conditions to be met, and they need to fully understand these deadlines and the potential consequences if they're not met. Now, I want to throw in a quick scenario because I'm representing a buyer right now, and we have a condo under contract, and the seller has to find another property. So it's subject to them finding a suitable home. But we have an unlimited contract. We don't have a date or deadline. So there's actually no way for that seller to get out of the contract. It didn't state a specific time, like the seller has to find a home by X amount of time. On my buyer's side, we can terminate that contract prior to the seller having another contract within 48 hours. So we only have to give them 48 hours notice in order to terminate that contract. That's a bad deal for the seller. The seller's agent didn't really think that through, but that's a contingency that I put in order to protect my buyers. So agents have to really understand who they're representing and how to put in the best possible terms. And it can get a little complicated. So if an agent's not really experienced, well, they won't know what to do. So when someone like me comes in, they might be blindsided and not really have fully thought through the consequences. Because we've now been under contract for 3 months. We haven't even done an inspection. And my buyers, they've had a couple trips, and they frankly haven't been able to find anything else that they like better to pursue. That seller could probably actually get a higher price for that property now if they were listing now. So they didn't have a great strategy in place. And frankly, I don't think that seller has great advice. So sellers need to ensure that there's an agreed upon time frame or a deadline for the condition to be met. It can't be open-ended, and they've got to fully understand these deadlines and the potential consequences if those conditions aren't met. Now, if one of these conditions contained in a contingency clause can't be met after every reasonable effort has been made to do so, then the contract ends and there's no legal obligation to complete the purchase or the sale. So for buyers, these serve as protections and also opportunities to terminate the contract and retain their deposit. Now, here at eXp Realty, I have access to the top 5% agents in every community across the US and Canada. Now, I have a relocation department, so no matter where you are located, I can help you find a top agent to help you through the buying or selling process. Now, simply fill out the form that's located in the description of this video. I've made it easy for you, and we will personally interview agents for you so that you don't have to. I know the questions to ask. I know what to look for. I help buyers and sellers all over find experienced agents to help them to buy or sell real estate. Or feel free to call me. Now, I can't help you if I don't hear from you, and I'm never too busy to help. Now, remember, who you work with matters.